She said, "I haven't been touched in years." I said, "Let me remind you of how it feels." On a warm late afternoon, he headed to Savannah's house, a widow who had been living alone since her husband's death. The excuse? A few repairs. But over the months, the visits became more than just that. A quiet attempt to be near her. Savannah, with her gentle elegance, carried a solitude that never spoke in words, until that day. But what happened next? No one could have imagined. If this story moves you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments where are you listening from. Your support keeps this channel alive. On a warm, silent, late afternoon, Thomas made his way to Savannah's house. The heat of the day still lingered in the air, but the city seemed to slow down as twilight approached. The sun had set, but the soft light filtering through the windows illuminated the path leading to the simple yet elegant house where the widow had lived alone since the death of her husband years ago. Thomas knew Savannah needed a few small repairs. Simple things like fixing the leaky kitchen faucet or adjusting a broken light bulb. But for him, this visit was more than just a favor. It was an excuse to be near her, to get closer to something he felt silently and unspoken. Their relationship until now had been built on small gestures. He would help, she would thank him, and the cycle would repeat. But now something felt different. He approached the front door, feeling the tension grow inside him. Savannah didn't know it, but he often found himself thinking about her. Whenever she called him to help with anything, he saw her as someone who needed company, someone who carried a deep loneliness that was never expressed openly. She was strong, but her fragility was stamped in the little things she didn't say, in the fleeting glances she occasionally cast. He noticed those details, but he never mentioned them. He always kept them to himself. "Did you bring everything you need?" Savannah asked, with a softness that could have been mistaken for politeness. But Thomas knew there was more in those words than she wanted to admit. Her voice had a lightness, but there was a subtle tension, almost imperceptible. "Of course, don't worry," he replied, stepping into the house and smelling the familiar scent of aged wood furniture, the fragrance of dried flowers she always kept on the shelves. There was something cozy about her house, but also something desolate, as if time had stood still in that place. They walked through the house, exchanging casual words about work and the necessary repairs. She guided him to the kitchen, and he noticed the little details: a glass of lemonade on the table, books in disorganized piles, the curtain gently swaying with the wind. But what truly caught his attention was the way Savannah moved. The light blue dress with faded flowers seemed to float around her, as if she were a character from an old movie, and the movement of the fabric as she walked followed the light coming through the window, creating a cinematic scene. He sat at the table, accepting the lemonade she offered him, more interested in her company than the drink itself. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but there was a subtle pressure, a feeling that words were on the verge of being spoken, but still weren't. "Do you miss anyone?" he asked, not thinking, trying to ease the growing tension. Savannah looked at him, a shy smile forming on her lips. But for a moment, the silence stretched between them like a blanket, covering any trivial conversation. Savannah placed the glass of lemonade on the table and stepped back slightly, her eyes fixed on something beyond Thomas. She seemed distant, and he knew there was something there, something she wasn't willing to share. She was looking at him, but at the same time, she seemed absent. He couldn't understand, but he felt that something was about to happen. "Maybe I'll run out of excuses to call you," she said, with a lightness in her voice that hid a weight. The soft, almost melancholic tone of her words made Thomas's heart beat faster. He turned to her, locking eyes. The phrase she said seemed simple, but it was as if an invisible wall had been broken. He felt a tightness in his chest, a sense that tonight wouldn't be like the others. There was something more there, something he couldn't define, but something he couldn't ignore. Savannah quickly looked away, as if regretting having spoken, but he knew. He knew she was trying to hide the vulnerability that accompanied her, trying to protect herself from what, perhaps, she feared more than loneliness: real connection. "I didn't want to bother you," she said, but the hesitation in her voice showed she didn't entirely believe what she was saying. Thomas stood up, determined not to let the moment slip away. He took a step toward her, not invading her space but staying close respectfully. He wanted to make her feel that he was there, with her, not as a distant friend, but as someone who, somehow, knew he could touch her soul. "When was the last time someone really saw you?" he asked, the words slipping out without thinking, but with a sincerity she couldn't ignore. She looked at him, her eyes softening for a brief moment before looking back at the floor. She didn't answer immediately, but Thomas knew she knew. She felt it just as he did, that something was about to change between them, something that couldn't be explained by words alone. In the days that followed, Thomas found himself thinking more and more about Savannah. The visits, which once seemed simple and without ulterior motives, now carried a different weight. The silence between them began to feel more comfortable, but also heavier, as if they were in some way waiting for something to happen. He wasn't sure exactly what he was seeking with these visits, but he knew that she felt the same, even without saying a word. The morning after the meeting where she had said, "Maybe I'll run out of excuses to call you," Thomas felt a flutter of nervousness as he headed to her house again. He knew she was waiting for him, not because of the repairs, but for something more subtle, more silent that was starting to grow between them. When he arrived at her house, Savannah was in the kitchen, as always. The daylight had softened, filtering through the open windows. She was wearing the light blue dress again, the faded flowers reflecting a soft, almost ethereal tone. There was something enchanting and melancholic about the way the fabric moved with the breeze, as if it were trying to hide the secrets she kept inside. She looked at him with a shy smile, but what Thomas noticed was more than that. There was a sparkle in her eyes, a kind of silent understanding that connected them. It was as if for a brief moment the distance between them had disappeared. "I was waiting for you," she said, as if it were something natural, as if it were normal to wait for someone who, until yesterday, had still just been a neighbor. But the tone in her voice, soft and almost reverent, made it clear that she knew what was happening. There was something more there, something beyond the simple act of repairing things in her house. They sat at the table, and Savannah brought over a glass of lemonade, as always. The drink was cold, but the temperature in the room seemed to rise with the growing tension between them. There was something in the air, something unsaid but clearly understood. They were about to cross an invisible line. As they talked about trivial things, Thomas felt her presence more intensely. The golden light of the late afternoon illuminated her face, making her look even more enchanting. He watched the way her fingers moved gently over the glass, as if she were trying to hide something. Something delicate, something vulnerable. And, unintentionally, he felt the weight of it, the weight of her loneliness, the silence, the absence of touch that she carried. It was then, almost imperceptibly, that she spoke, and something inside him broke. "Maybe I'll run out of excuses to call you," she said again. But this time her words were heavier, more laden. She looked at him with an expression that Thomas didn't know how to interpret. It was as if she were testing something, as if she were giving herself over, but not completely. He sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the gravity of her words. But before he could say anything, she turned away as if trying to hide the vulnerability she had shown. "I'm not good at asking for help, or letting myself need someone," she said, her voice low, as if it were a confession. Those words, spoken with such sincerity, hit Thomas in a way he hadn't expected. He stood up and approached her, not invasively, but calmly, silently, as if respecting her space. He touched her arm lightly, not wanting to invade, but wanting to show that he was there for her. "You see me, don't you?" she asked, her voice almost inaudible. That question, simple and profound, made Thomas's heart race. He now watched her with more attention, as if he had seen something in her that had been hidden before. Something more, something he could no longer ignore. She was more than a lonely woman longing for a touch. She was a whole woman, with a life, a story, and a heart he wanted to understand. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved even closer, and she didn't pull away. The moment was filled with a silence that spoke louder than any words could. They didn't need words now. They only needed presence. When she looked into his eyes again, Thomas knew she was ready for more. Not more words, but more action. The tension between them grew, but in an almost tangible way, like something was about to explode. And all he could do was follow her down this path. The light of the evening, the softness of the surroundings, the way they were so close, yet still so distant. It all made the moment feel more than real. It was like a waking dream. They were about to cross a line that there would be no turning back from. In the days that followed, something within Savannah seemed to change. The interactions between her and Thomas were becoming more natural, but the silent tension never disappeared. She began to expect his visits more openly, perhaps even without realizing it. Sometimes when he arrived, she was more put together, more aware of his presence, as if she were trying to show something she still couldn't express. But it was that afternoon, while she was tidying up the living room, that something changed irreversibly. Savannah was sitting at the table, a cup of tea in her hands, her eyes fixed on nothing. The soft light of the evening filtered through the window, casting long shadows on the walls, and the house was enveloped in a deep silence. It was the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but brought with it a sense of expectation, as if something was about to be revealed. Thomas approached, but hesitated when he saw her so distant. He sat in the chair across from her, watching her carefully, as if he could feel the weight she carried but never mentioned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only the sound of breathing and the gentle clink of the teacup broke the stillness. It was then that suddenly she looked at him, her eyes meeting his as if, for the first time, she saw him in a different way. No longer just the neighbor, the friend who helped with repairs, but someone who might understand something deeper. "I haven't been touched in years," she said, her voice soft but laden with unspoken pain. The words hung in the air between them, like a weight she had never let fall until that moment. Thomas felt a lump tighten in his throat. He knew that the phrase wasn't just about the absence of physical touch, but about the absence of something more. The absence of true affection, of real connection, of a touch that carried more than physical need, something deep enough to heal the wounds time and solitude had left on her soul. He didn't know what to say, and for a moment, no words seemed adequate. How do you respond to something so deeply personal, so intimate, without it sounding hollow? How do you acknowledge the pain of someone so used to living in silence, not expecting or asking for more? Savannah seemed vulnerable in a way she had never shown before. The elegance she had always carried was still there, but now it was like a facade slowly crumbling, allowing her fragility to come to the surface. And Thomas knew that this was the key to everything that was happening between them. She wasn't asking for a fleeting kindness. She wasn't seeking a superficial caress. She was asking for something more, something she feared she could no longer find. A true connection. He extended his hand gently, almost without thinking. She looked at him, her eyes softening, but still there was hesitation, a fear. The fear of being seen, of being vulnerable, of letting someone into a space she had closed off for so long. I don't know what it's like to be touched for real anymore," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "It's been so long. I've gotten used to the absence. I've gotten used to not needing any of this." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. Her words were a reflection of something he had already known, but had never been said. He had seen her loneliness in her eyes before, but he hadn't realized how deeply disconnected she felt from the world. Touch for her wasn't just about the lack of physical contact, but about the lack of everything that came with it. Affection, care, respect, presence. "You don't have to get used to it," Thomas replied, his voice soft, almost like a whisper. He touched her hand delicately, as if it were fragile, something precious. "I see you, Savannah, I see who you are. And you don't have to live alone with this pain anymore." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if the simple presence of him and the words he had said to her were a silent blessing. It was as if she were absorbing the warmth of his touch, not just physically, but emotionally. It was something she hadn't known she was missing until that moment. I don't know what to do with this," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of being weak, scared of letting myself feel again." Those words pierced through Thomas like a blade. He knew how much she had been protecting herself, how she had built a wall around herself to avoid being hurt again. But he also knew that without taking this risk, She would never experience the kind of affection she longed for, but feared. "Softness can heal too," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Hey, it's not weakness, Savannah. It's the only way to truly live." Savannah looked at him then, and in that moment, he saw something new in her eyes. The acceptance that maybe, just maybe, she could allow herself to feel something more, something she never imagined could be possible again. It wasn't a romantic love nor a physical attraction. It was something much deeper, the chance to be seen, understood, and touched with respect and compassion. She slowly raised her hand, hesitantly, but finally placed it over his. The gesture wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was enough to break the barrier between them. It was a simple gesture, but a gesture of trust, of openness. What had begun as a simple, casual visit was now becoming something more. Something that could no longer be ignored. Something they both felt, but didn't always know how to express. In the days that followed, the dynamic between Thomas and Savannah began to transform. The silence between them, which had once been heavy and full of unsaid things, now felt more comfortable, more intimate. They exchanged looks full of meaning, delicate touches that didn't invade, but said more than any words could express. But what was happening between them was still not entirely clear even to Savannah. The next morning she called him again. This time, the request wasn't about repairs. She just wanted company. The simple request felt like a disguised invitation, a call for help that had nothing to do with the house or the small tasks. It was a request to be with her, to share a moment of quiet. She knew she didn't need to ask for anything more. He would understand. When he arrived, she was in the living room, dressed more casually than usual, but still with a subtle elegance. Her hair was loose, falling gently over her shoulders, and her eyes, when they met his, held a softness that Thomas wasn't used to seeing. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the garden, as if waiting for his arrival, but in a way that didn't show anxiety, only a serene calmness. "I just wanted to spend some time with you," she said, her voice low but sincere. It wasn't an explicit invitation, but it was clear enough for him to understand what she wanted. She wanted more. She wanted his presence. And this was something she hadn't allowed anyone in her life for so long. Thomas sat next to her, taking his time. He knew something new was happening, something they were both still trying to understand. But for him, that moment of stillness, that comfortable silence was what they needed. There was no need for rush, words, or promises. What was between them was something that grew slowly, almost like a flower blooming. But even with the tension eased, there was a sense of fear hanging in the air. Savannah was no longer the distant, reticent woman she had been. She was allowing herself to feel, but there was something in her behavior that suggested she was uncomfortable with the intensity of the feelings that were beginning to emerge. Thomas's kindness, the way he treated her, the way he was there for her, with no rush or demands, was beginning to scare her. She didn't know what to do with it. His touch, his affection, his kindness, all of that was so different from what she was used to. To her, kindness had always been a luxury she couldn't afford. The time she spent alone had taught her to be independent, to expect nothing from anyone. But now with him, everything seemed to be changing. And that change frightened her. "You don't have to do this, you know," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to be so kind." Thomas looked at her, confused, not completely understanding what she was trying to say. He wasn't pressuring her. He wasn't expecting anything from her. He was just there, being kind, being present. But her reaction made him realize something important. To her, kindness wasn't something easy to accept. To her, kindness was vulnerability, and vulnerability was something she didn't know how to handle. "It's not about being kind, Savannah," he replied softly. "It's about being present. I'm here because I want to be, and you don't need to do anything with that. Just let yourself be seen, let yourself be you." She looked at him, her expression mixing doubt and understanding. She was starting to understand, but there was still something holding her back from completely surrendering. She moved slightly away, as if trying to protect something deep inside herself. "I got used to the silence. I got used to the loneliness," she said, her words low, almost like a confession. "Now you're offering me something I don't know what to do with." He didn't answer right away. He didn't know what else he could say to ease the tension. What was happening between them wasn't simple, and he knew that. But what he wanted was for her to know that she didn't need to be afraid of him, that she didn't need to protect herself from something that only wished to help her. "You don't have to do anything with this," he said finally. "I just want you to know that I'm here, and you can feel, without fear, without rush." Savannah closed her eyes for a moment, as if his words had touched something deep inside her. When she opened her eyes again, there was a softness in them that he hadn't seen before. She was beginning to allow herself to feel, but the fear was still there, invisible, hovering in the air. She slowly shook her head, as if she were trying to understand her own emotions. "I don't know if I can allow myself to feel, Thomas. I'm scared. Scared of becoming weak." Thomas gently placed his hand over hers. "Softness can heal too, Savannah. True strength is in allowing yourself to be vulnerable." She looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also with a timid hope. Maybe, with time, she could learn to let go of the fear. Maybe, with time, she could learn to allow herself to feel again. But for now, what remained between them was the simple act of being there together in silence, and the kindness that, little by little, was beginning to become the greatest strength of all. The following days passed more slowly than usual, as if time itself had slowed down. Or perhaps it was the way Savannah began to perceive the world around her. She felt her life gradually transforming, as if the walls she had built over the years for safety were beginning to crumble. And in each of these moments of vulnerability, she saw Thomas there asking for nothing but simply being. It was something new and at the same time something frightening. But still, she found herself wanting more. Savannah sat at the table once again, a cup of tea in her hands, looking out the window as if searching for an answer in the leaves that moved gently with the breeze. Thomas sat across from her, silent, as if he knew words weren't necessary. It was as if what was happening between them was deeper than any explanation, but eventually words would become inevitable. Savannah looked at him, her eyes shining with an intensity she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew what she wanted to say, but she was scared. Scared to finally open up, to surrender completely to something that could be more than she could handle. Something that would pull her out of her comfort zone and put her face to face with everything she feared. "I don't remember what it's like to feel loved," she said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made the air around them feel even denser. The words came out of her mouth with a raw honesty, like a confession she never thought she would make. But somehow it felt like the right moment. She felt that she was on the verge of breaking down the last barrier that kept her from something bigger, something more genuine. Those words left Thomas speechless. He knew the pain she carried wasn't something he could fix with a single gesture. But in that moment, he understood that what she needed wasn't quick solutions, but a safe space where she could allow herself to feel. He didn't want her to feel pressured, but he knew that perhaps the greatest gift he could give her was simply being the person she could be vulnerable with, without the fear of judgment. He didn't know what to say immediately. Instead of words, he decided to act with what he knew to be genuine and respectful. He moved closer to Savannah, but without invading her space. He just touched her hand gently, as if asking for permission, with no hurry. She didn't pull away. On the contrary, her fingers intertwined softly with his. There was no rush, no unnecessary intensity. It was a simple touch, almost like a silent confirmation that she was ready to allow herself to feel again. Not just physically, but emotionally. "I'm scared," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Scared to give myself over to this. Scared that if I let myself feel again, I'll lose control of something I can't manage." Thomas looked at her with a calm expression, but his eyes were full of a silent understanding. He knew that this fear wasn't something she could simply push away, but at the same time he knew that the only way to truly heal was to allow herself to feel, even if it was painful. "I'm scared too," he replied, his voice low but filled with sincerity that reached deep into her soul. "Scared that you'll think I'm trying something I'm not. But what I want, Savannah, is for you to know that I see you. I see who you are, with all your pain, all your beauty, all your strength." She looked at him in silence, absorbing his words, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. The tension in the air between them slowly dissipated, and something new began to emerge. Not a romantic love, not a sudden passion, but something deeper, more stable. A genuine connection born from mutual understanding and acceptance. Savannah closed her eyes for a moment, as if allowing his words and his sincerity to touch her deeply. She allowed herself for a moment not to be the strong woman she had gotten used to being. She allowed herself to be vulnerable, and it made her feel more alive than she had in many years. "I'm scared of losing control," she said, her voice almost inaudible. "I've gotten used to the silence, to the loneliness. Now that you're here, with your kindness, I feel lost. I don't know what to do with it." Thomas didn't respond immediately, but he held her hand with more firmness, gently but with determination. He wanted her to know, without words, that she wasn't alone. He was here with her, willing to wait as long as necessary. "You don't need to control everything, Savannah," he said, his voice gently reassuring. "Sometimes letting go is the only way to truly live." She looked at him, her eyes now softer, less filled with fear. She knew that what he was offering was something she had never allowed herself. A chance to feel, to be seen, to be cared for in a way she had never known how to ask for. In that moment, Savannah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not a grand or utopian hope, but a small, powerful hope. The hope that maybe with time she could learn to set aside her fear. Maybe with time she could learn to allow herself to feel again. But for now, what remained between them was the simple act of being there, together, in silence, and the kindness that little by little was beginning to become the greatest strength of all. Time seemed to stretch almost magically between them. Thomas's visits continued, but now they were different. They were no longer just an excuse for repairs, but an opportunity for something deeper, something unspoken but lived. Each time he entered that house, Savannah seemed more at ease, more present, more willing to let herself be seen, touched, and felt. The afternoon after her confession, he found her in the living room as usual. This time she was lying on the couch, looking out the window. The soft light of the late afternoon illuminated her face, casting delicate shadows that danced across her skin. She seemed calm, but there was a slight tension in her shoulders, as if something was about to happen. Thomas entered the room without saying a word, just observing her for a moment. He felt something new between them, something stronger, more palpable, but still delicate. He knew she was beginning to open up, but there was a space between them that needed to be filled. Not with words, but with something deeper. He approached the couch without rushing, without forcing anything. Savannah didn't look at him immediately, but he knew she was aware of his presence. She always was. But what had changed now was that, instead of pulling away or hiding, she stayed there, as if she were allowing his proximity to be a source of comfort. Thomas sat beside her, not too close, but just enough for her to feel his presence. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who understand each other, without needing words. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes gently tired, as if she were holding something inside. She didn't say anything, but there was an intensity in her gaze that made Thomas's chest tighten. He knew what she was feeling, because he felt it too. It was the weight of connection, the weight of being so close to someone, yet still so distant. Without saying a word, he slowly reached his hand toward her face. It wasn't an impulsive action, but something he knew he needed to do. He wanted to touch her, not with urgency, but with respect. He wanted her to know that he was there for her, not just physically, but in a way that was emotionally real. Savannah flinched slightly but didn't pull away. She didn't pull away this time. When Thomas's fingers touched her skin, something changed. She closed her eyes, not in shame, but as if she were allowing that touch to envelop her, as if he were filling her in a way she hadn't allowed in a long time. She surrendered to that simple gesture like a child who finally feels warmth after an endless winter. Thomas's touch wasn't invasive, it wasn't demanding. It was soft, almost reverent. It was a touch that asked for nothing, but at the same time, offered everything. He didn't want her to feel pressured, but he also wanted her to know that she was still alive, still desired, still worthy of being touched with kindness and respect. She took a deep breath, her eyes still closed, feeling the softness of his hand on her face. It was as if in that simple gesture, something inside her began to unravel. The layers of protection, of self-restraint that she had built over the years were starting to disappear. She no longer needed to protect herself. She no longer needed to be afraid. I don't know what to do with this, she said, her voice soft, almost inaudible. The vulnerability in her words made Thomas's heart race. He knew how much she was surrendering, how much she was allowing the softness of his touch to reach her. "You don't have to do anything, Savannah," he replied, his voice soft and calm. "Just feel. Allow yourself to feel." She didn't respond immediately. She just breathed deeply, as if his words had penetrated her soul. She felt something she didn't know how to describe, something that had been lost, but was now finding its way back. The part of herself that she had buried for so long was beginning to rise again, slowly with some fear, but also with the hope that maybe it was possible to live again. Savannah opened her eyes and looked at Thomas with an intensity he had never seen before. Her eyes were filled with something new, something she didn't know if she could hold on to. But in that moment she was ready to try. "You're the first person to touch me like this in years," she said, still with a tone of surprise in her voice. "I'd forgotten what this feels like." Thomas felt a wave of emotion hearing that. He knew it wasn't just about a physical touch. It was about acceptance, trust, and, above all, love. Not romantic or carnal love, but the love that comes from understanding, care, and respect. "I won't force anything, Savannah," he said softly, "but know that as long as you need, I'll be here. No rush, just being." She looked at him, and for the first time she smiled. It wasn't a big or joyful smile, but a gentle smile, full of something she had lost a long time ago. Hope. And as much as fear still lingered, she knew he was right. Maybe it wasn't about doing something, but about allowing herself to be. She was beginning to understand that, and with that understanding, something inside her began to heal. That afternoon was different. There was no rush, no expectations, just the quiet between them, which now seemed precious, something that didn't need to be filled with words. Savannah and Thomas found themselves on the couch again, but this time, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, it had a kind of tranquility they had never shared before. It was as if silence had become the fertile ground where all the unspoken feelings could grow. She rested her head on his shoulder, without asking for permission, simply doing it as if she felt safe. And he didn't hesitate. He didn't pull away. There was no hurry in anything. They were there together, but in a stillness that meant more than any conversation they could have had. They were accepting the moment, accepting each other's presence without rushing for anything else to happen. The soft aroma of the tea Savannah had made still lingered in the air, and the late afternoon light poured through the window, casting soft shadows around them. The atmosphere was calm, serene. Savannah could feel the warmth of Thomas by her side, the firmness of his presence, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to pull away, to protect herself. It was as if the world outside didn't matter. Here in the shared silence, she allowed herself to be who she truly was, without masks, without defenses. And he was there, with her, not as someone who needed to solve something, but as someone who was simply present. He knew that what was happening between them couldn't be forced, couldn't be rushed. It was a slow process, a transformation that was happening bit by bit, but it was happening, and he could feel it. Savannah took a deep breath, closing her eyes, feeling the peace of the moment. She wasn't used to this. Silence for her had always been a place of loneliness, an empty space where the memories of the past haunted her. But now, beside Thomas, silence was different. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't empty. It was a space where she could finally breathe, where she could allow herself to feel without the fear of being judged or disturbed. Thomas, for his part, felt the same calm, as if that moment was a gift. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to do anything other than be there. The touch of Savannah's hand over his, the way she nestled into his shoulder, everything seemed right. He knew she was breaking down barriers, that she was allowing something she had never allowed before. The intimacy of being vulnerable, without fear, without the urge to escape. The absence of words didn't mean the absence of feeling. On the contrary, there was something deeper in that silence, something that spoke of the comfort of companionship, of mutual acceptance. They didn't need to say anything to understand each other. They knew what the other was feeling, and that was enough. Savannah, with her head still resting on Thomas's shoulder, felt the need to break the silence. But instead of words, she did something simple. She squeezed his hand, a small action, but full of meaning. He squeezed her hand back without haste, without demands, just a gesture of reaffirmation, of presence. She then looked at him, her eyes soft, and said in a voice barely audible, but filled with something she couldn't name, "I'm not alone, am I?" Thomas looked at her with a gentle smile, his gaze full of understanding, and replied with a serene sincerity, "No, never again." The answer was simple, but both of them knew there was something deep in it, something that in some way both souls knew to be true. She wasn't alone anymore, neither emotionally nor physically. The loneliness she had carried for so long seemed to have lessened, but not because he had filled it with words, but because he was there, with her, in that exact moment. He saw her. He understood her. He was willing to wait for her, without rushing. Savannah closed her eyes again, feeling the warmth of his body beside hers, the warmth of acceptance. It wasn't something physical. It was something emotional, something that filled the void she had carried inside herself. It was his presence, not as a solution, but as a confirmation that she wasn't lost anymore. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment she knew that at least for now, she could live without the weight of the loneliness that had always followed her. She wasn't alone anymore, and that in itself was enough. Thomas stayed by her side without rushing to speak or do anything. He knew that silence spoke more than words ever could. He was there, and she knew that. And as simple as that was what mattered. Several weeks passed, and something inside Savannah had definitely changed. She felt lighter, more open, and above all, more present. Thomas's visits were no longer a quiet obligation or a favor for a smile. They had transformed into moments of true connection. She sought him out, not only because of the small tasks around the house, but for his company, for the silent and comforting presence he brought. That afternoon, she called him again. It wasn't about repairs nor anything that needed to be done. She just wanted to be with him, to have more than the loneliness she had always carried. She wanted the company of someone who, in some way, had become indispensable to her. And more importantly, she knew she no longer needed to hide that. When Thomas arrived, she greeted him with a calm smile, but there was something different in her eyes. It was as if she had finally allowed herself to accept the change that was happening within her. She no longer looked at him with the same hesitation, with the same fear of opening up. She knew she could trust him, and that was a silent relief. "The hallway light is flickering again," she said with a light smile. But both knew it wasn't about the light. She knew what she meant. He knew what she was trying to say. It was as if she was inviting him to be part of something more, something that was beginning to form between them, but she still didn't know how to name it. Thomas looked at her with a gentle smile, understanding the unspoken message. He approached and she moved back slightly, but not with the same distance from before. There was space between them, but not the kind of distance that had existed before. It was a comfortable space, something they had learned to share. He wasn't there to force anything. He was there because he wanted to be, because he felt something genuine happening. "I thought you were starting to get used to this," he said, his words soft but carrying a deep meaning. She looked at him with a slight smile, but there was a touch of nervousness in her expression. "I am," she replied, her voice calmer than he imagined. "I just still don't know what to do with this, with you, with what this means." There was something new in her voice, something she hadn't had before, acceptance but also uncertainty. She was no longer protecting herself, but she didn't know how to handle his proximity. She allowed herself to be vulnerable, but with the awareness that there was still fear. Fear of losing herself in something she didn't know how to control. Thomas, for his part, was there, ready to wait as long as it took. He wouldn't pressure her, wouldn't rush the process. He knew that for her, this was more than simple companionship. It was a process of rediscovering herself, of learning to trust and allow herself to feel again. "You don't need to have all the answers right now, Savannah," he said, with a patience that reflected what he felt. I don't have them either. But what I do know is that what we're doing is real. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's genuine. She looked at him with a depth in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. It was as if she was seeing something in herself she hadn't been able to understand before. She was beginning to accept what was between them. And that acceptance, as quiet as it was all she needed in that moment. I don't know how to deal with this, she said, her voice soft, almost like a confession. I've lived so long without needing anyone, and now that you're here, I feel different, and I don't know if I'm ready for this. Thomas watched her for a moment, and then without hurry he moved closer to her. It wasn't an impulsive movement, but a calm decision, full of respect and consideration. He sat next to her, keeping a distance that wasn't invasive, but still conveyed his presence. I don't want you to be someone different, Savannah, he replied with sincerity. I just want you to be yourself. And if that means being by my side, then that's what matters. She remained silent for a moment, absorbing his words. Something began to unravel inside her. The fear, the insecurity, the need to control, it all started to give way. She didn't know how the future would unfold, but in that moment she knew that, at least for now, she wasn't alone anymore. Maybe I'm afraid of losing myself, Thomas, she said, her voice now more steady. But maybe I'm also afraid of finding myself, of discovering what I can truly be. He smiled softly, as if he was finally seeing the true Savannah. Not the woman hiding behind the walls of solitude, but the woman who was allowing herself to be seen, touched, and lived again. I don't want you to lose yourself, Savannah. I just want you to allow yourself to be who you really are. And if that includes being with me, then I'll be here, waiting. She looked at him, her eyes shining with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Maybe she didn't have all the answers, but in that moment she knew she was ready to take the next step, not alone but with him by her side. The days that followed brought with them a quiet peace between Thomas and Savannah. Something was happening between them, but it was still something they couldn't quite define. They shared moments together calmly, without rushing, without labels, but with a genuine presence that both of them felt. Every small gesture became meaningful. Every exchanged look, every touch, every unspoken word seemed to carry an emotional weight that they both knew they couldn't ignore for much longer. That afternoon, she invited him again, but this time, it wasn't just to spend time together. She wanted to talk. She wanted to share something with him, something she hadn't spoken about to anyone since her husband's death, something she feared, if said, would make her seem weak, too vulnerable. But she knew he would understand. Thomas had, until then, been the only person who truly saw her, without rushing to judge, without filling the silences with empty words. He simply accepted her. When he arrived at her house, she found him in the kitchen, as usual. The soft light of the late afternoon filtered through the windows, illuminating her face with a tenderness that made her feel even more vulnerable. Thomas entered the room and found her there with a calm smile, but with something different in her gaze. She didn't know how to put it into words, but his presence seemed to make the air around her heavier, more charged. She invited him to sit, and the two of them stayed silent for a moment. It wasn't uncomfortable, but a subtle tension filled the space between them. Savannah knew that the conversation she was about to have with him would change everything. She had been quiet for so long, but now she felt it was time to be open, to reveal what she had hidden for so long. I want to tell you about my husband, she said, her voice low but firm. Thomas looked at her attentively, his expression soft, but with an intensity that showed he was fully present for her. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that she needed to do this. She needed to say the words that had been trapped in her chest for so long. Savannah took a deep breath and continued, her voice breaking slightly, but not interrupting the flow of her words. When he died, I felt a loss, of course, but what I felt most was the absence of something that had never been there. I know he loved me in his way, but he never truly saw me. He never really saw me. He never touched me in a way that made me know he was truly there with me. He was present, but not in a way I needed. I was always invisible to him, Thomas, and I got used to that. Her words hung heavily in the air, and for a moment Thomas didn't know what to say. He felt the weight of that confession. He didn't know what it was like to be someone who wasn't seen, but he knew that, at least in that moment, she was being seen. He saw her. He knew what she was feeling. "I didn't know what to do with that, Thomas," she continued. "When you started showing up, I tried to keep my distance. I tried to hold on to my loneliness because it was all I knew. But then you saw me. You touched me in such a gentle, respectful way that it made me remember something I had lost so long ago. The ability to be seen, to be touched, to be desired in a way that wasn't empty." Thomas didn't say anything. He simply moved closer and took her hand without haste, without words, just being the presence she needed. It wasn't something grand or dramatic. It was simply the truth of being there, in the moment, with her. It was the response she needed. And she knew it. Savannah looked at him, and for the first time she didn't feel ashamed. She didn't feel weak. She felt human, whole, more than anything she had been in the past few years. She was allowing herself to be touched in a way she never imagined was possible. "I didn't know how much I needed this until now," she whispered. "I didn't know how much I needed you, Thomas. To have someone see me, touch me, desire me in a real way." Thomas looked at her with affection, and then, with a soft movement, he pulled her closer. He didn't kiss her, not immediately. He simply held her, with a delicate strength, as if holding something precious. He knew she didn't need an explosion of emotions at that moment. What she needed was the simple gesture of being cared for, being accepted, without haste. "I will always be here for you, Savannah," he said, his voice deep and filled with sincerity. "I won't abandon you, and I won't let you go back to the place of loneliness you were in. I see you, I see everything you are, and that's what matters." She closed her eyes, letting his words sink into her heart. For the first time in a long time, she felt the softness of the world around her, without the weight of loneliness, without the feeling of being invisible. She was there, with him, and he saw her, and that was all she needed in that moment. She moved slightly away, looked into his eyes and said with a lightness she hadn't felt in years, "Maybe we should stop fighting against what's already here." And in that moment, Thomas knew that this was just the beginning of something new, something real, something both of them had waited for but never knew was possible until now. Time passed, but something between Thomas and Savannah remained stable and deep. The visits became more frequent, and the conversations that once were light began to touch on deeper matters. They no longer saw each other just as neighbors or friends. There was something more, something they both felt but weren't yet ready to name. Savannah allowed herself to be more vulnerable now, but there was a persistent fear, an internal resistance she couldn't entirely shake. She felt the change. She knew she was opening up in a way she never had before, but there was always that voice inside her telling her that softness could be dangerous, that by surrendering she risked getting hurt again. The past, with all its pain and loneliness, still haunted her, and she feared that happiness was something fleeting, that it would disappear as quickly as it had appeared. That afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, the conversation flowed naturally. But the weight of what they both felt was always there, in the unspoken words, in the silent gestures, in the way they looked at each other. It was as if they were slowly allowing themselves to step towards something bigger, but doubt still hung in the air. Savannah looked at him, her eyes heavy with a mix of hope and apprehension. She felt something she didn't know how to deal with. She felt safe with him, but at the same time, the insecurity of the past kept her on alert. She feared that by allowing herself to be happy, it would mean she was surrendering to something that wouldn't last. "I'm scared," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was a slight tremor in it. "I'm scared that all of this is just a fleeting moment. What we're doing, is it real, Thomas?" Her words hit Thomas like a lightning bolt. He knew she was referring to what was between them, the silent connection that had been growing with each passing day. He knew Savannah was struggling with the idea that something good could finally happen to her, but she also feared that happiness was transient. The fear of the pain that love could cause her paralyzed her. He moved closer to her, slowly, and touched her hand. The softness of his touch was more than physical. It was a silent promise that he was there, willing to wait as long as necessary. "I understand the fear, Savannah," he said calmly. I'm afraid too. Afraid that by allowing myself to see you, I'll lose myself. But if we don't try, if we don't allow this to grow, we'll never know what it could be. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting a sadness she didn't know how to explain. She didn't know what to do with his softness. She had never known how to handle someone who didn't want to take something from her, but simply was there to be present. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He was just there, being. I've gotten used to the fear, she whispered. I've gotten used to loneliness. Now that you're here, I feel like somehow I'm stopping being who I've been for so long. And that scares me, because if I give myself to this, I might lose myself. Thomas looked at her with silent intensity, the understanding in his eyes deeper than any words could express. He knew she was allowing herself to take a step toward something she never thought was possible. And he also knew that this step would require courage, perhaps more than she believed she had. It's not about losing who you are, Savannah. It's about finding who you really are, he said, his voice gentle but full of conviction. I don't want to change you. I want you to allow yourself to be who you are, without the fear of getting hurt, without the fear of surrendering. Love doesn't have to be something that destroys. It can be something that heals. Savannah remained silent, absorbing his words. For the first time, she felt a true freedom as she heard them. She didn't need to be afraid of surrendering, of being seen and touched in a genuine way. The fear of losing herself, of becoming vulnerable, was still there. But now she knew it didn't have to be an obstacle. The fear was just part of the process. The real risk was in not allowing good things to happen. She squeezed his hand, a sense of relief washing over her. It wasn't complete relief, but it was a start. It was the first time in a long time that she felt she was truly allowing something new, something good, to enter her life. Maybe you're right, she said, her voice firmer than before. Maybe I need to allow myself more, and maybe that means living with more fear, but it could also mean living with more love. Thomas smiled softly, holding her hand with more strength now, as if anchoring her in the present moment. He knew she was taking a big step, a step that required courage, and he wasn't in a hurry. He didn't want her to rush. He just wanted her to know he would be by her side, supporting every movement, every decision she made. I'll be here, Savannah. No rush, no expectations. Just here. And if you lose yourself, I'll help you find your way back. She looked at him, her eyes now clearer, more serene, as if she had finally found some peace. And in that moment, she knew the fear was still there, but now she had something greater to face it. She had someone by her side. And that in some way made her believe she was ready to face whatever came next. Summer was coming to an end, but the atmosphere in Savannah's home still carried a softness that only the last days of heat could bring. She and Thomas continued to meet, and what once seemed like a silent friendship had now grown into something deeper, more complex. They no longer needed words to express what they were feeling. It was a silent understanding, built through touches, glances, and small gestures of affection. That evening she invited him to stay. But it wasn't just any invitation. It was an invitation for something more, something she felt but didn't know how to translate into words. They were growing together, each dealing with their own fears and expectations, but something indescribable was happening between them, something that defied the limitations they had imposed on themselves. When Thomas arrived, he found her in the living room, as usual. She was lying on the sofa, barefoot, her hair loose. The soft light of the lamp by the window illuminated her face delicately, making her appear even more serene but also vulnerable. She was waiting for him, but there was no anxiety in her posture. There was something deeper, as if she were ready to embrace whatever came, without fear. She watched him enter, and he noticed the calm in her eyes. They were different, not just in terms of proximity, but something in her expression told him they both knew they were about to take an important step. The silence between them, once comfortable, now carried a soft tension. They no longer needed to protect themselves, no longer needed to hide what they were feeling. "Do you want to stay a little longer?" she asked, her tone barely perceptible, but enough for him to know she wasn't pulling away anymore. The invitation was there, simple and direct, but with something more, something they both understood. She no longer wanted to keep the distance. She wanted to be real with him, without fears, without insecurities. Thomas smiled, his response coming naturally with gentleness. "Of course, if you don't mind." And there they were in silence, as if time had stopped. He sat beside her, and there was no need for words. It wasn't a moment of rush or urgency. It was a moment where they allowed themselves to simply be together, with no pressure, no expectations. They stayed there, side by side, for a while, breathing in the same rhythm. The world outside that room didn't matter anymore. There was something so powerful in the quiet of that moment that it seemed everything around them had disappeared. Finally, Savannah closed her eyes and, in a simple gesture, rested her head on his shoulder. He looked at her for a moment, his heart beating a little faster, but in a calm way. He knew that what was happening between them was real. It wasn't a fantasy, it wasn't a dream. It was something that was happening, slowly, without hurry, but with a depth he hadn't expected. She was letting him in, and he knew that was something big. "Are you scared?" she asked, her voice soft, as if the question was more a reflection than a doubt. He looked at her, absorbing the tone of her voice. It wasn't a simple question, it was an opening. She was allowing him to see her once again without barriers. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "I'm scared too. But I think that's how real things happen, don't you think? Without haste, without formulas, just being." Savannah didn't say anything, but the expression on her face softened even more. She was beginning to understand. Fear wasn't an obstacle. It was a natural part of the process. They didn't need to fight it anymore. They just needed to let things happen. He then hugged her, not with urgency, but with a softness that seemed to protect the moment. He wanted her to know, without words, that he was there, not for a day, not for a night, but for everything that was to come. He knew they were starting something with no return, and that was something they both had to accept. She nestled closer, feeling the safety in his embrace, as if she were finally finding the safe space she had always searched for, but never knew where to find. It was a silent space, but powerful. She was allowing herself to be vulnerable, no longer afraid of being hurt. She knew that, by surrendering to him, she wasn't losing herself, but finding herself. "I'm here," he whispered, his words more than simple comfort. They were a promise that he wouldn't let her go, that he wouldn't let her lose herself, no matter what the future held. She closed her eyes, letting his words sink into her soul, and for the first time in a long time she didn't feel alone. She knew that in that moment, something inside her was being restored, something she had lost and was now beginning to find again. Love didn't have to be a force that overwhelmed. It could be silent, gentle, and still powerful. Savannah fell asleep beside Thomas that night without fears, without barriers. And at dawn she woke up, looked at him, and whispered with a soft smile, "You stayed." And he, with a peaceful smile, responded, "I said I would stay." Time passed, and with it came change. Not just in Savannah's life, but in both of their lives. What had started as an apparently simple encounter between neighbors had now become a story of transformation. A story of two people, with painful pasts and deep scars, finding healing and connection in each other. Savannah was no longer the closed-off and solitary woman Thomas had met months ago. She was more alive, more open, more capable of allowing herself to feel. He, in turn, was no longer the man who simply took care of tasks around the house, but someone who had become genuinely involved with her, deeply. The days that followed were filled with small changes. With every meeting, every exchanged glance, their bond strengthened. But there was still something unspoken, something they both knew was about to happen. They were on the brink of something new, and though both knew the future was uncertain, they also knew what they shared was real and strong enough to withstand whatever challenges came their way. That afternoon, as if fate were playing with timing, Savannah called him again, but this time the conversation would be different. She didn't just want to see what he thought or how he would react. She wanted to say something that had crossed her mind countless times, but that she had never had the courage to express. When Thomas arrived at her house, she was on the porch, looking out at the horizon. The soft light of the setting sun reflected on her face, making her look almost ethereal. She saw him approach and smiled, but it wasn't a smile of a woman still lost in her fears. It was a smile of someone who had finally found the courage to be who she truly was. She invited him to sit beside her as always, but there was something in the air now. An energy, different, more intense, more meaningful. Thomas knew that something important was about to be said. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, her voice soft but firm. "About what's happened between us, about everything I've felt and learned. I can't keep living in the past, Thomas. I can't keep hiding behind everything that's hurt me." He looked at her, his expression calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. He didn't interrupt, just allowed her to speak, waiting for the words that would reveal what she had been carrying inside. "When you came into my life, I thought it would just be another fleeting moment. I was used to living alone, to not needing anyone, but you made me realize something I didn't want to admit. I'm not alone anymore. I don't have to hide from myself anymore." She paused for a moment, as if gathering the courage to take the final step. He watched her, completely present, as he always had been. "I don't know what the future holds for us, Thomas, but what I do know is that with you by my side, I'm allowing myself to live. And that's all I need right now. I don't want to go back to what I was before. I want to live with you, here and now." She looked at him with a vulnerability he had never imagined seeing. It was as if, in that moment, all the barriers she had built fell away, and what remained was a woman ready to surrender to what was in front of her, without fear. Thomas didn't speak immediately. He simply moved closer and placed his hand gently over hers. He didn't need to say more. His eyes spoke for him, and the connection between them grew deeper, stronger. "You don't have to hide anymore, Savannah," he said with a calm that made her feel a wave of relief. "I'm here, and if you let me, I want to be by your side. Not to fill the void, but to share what's to come." She smiled, a genuine smile with her eyes shining with a new hope. She didn't need grand promises, didn't need definitive answers. What she needed, and what she now had, was the simple knowledge that she was no longer alone. And that was enough. The sun set, and the soft colors of the evening reflected on their faces. It was a moment of transition, of renewal. It wasn't an end, but a beginning. A new beginning for Savannah, for Thomas, and for whatever the future had in store for them. She didn't know exactly what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was clear: she was ready to live it, with all its uncertainties and wonders, by the side of someone who finally saw her. Someone who understood her, accepted her and loved her without haste, without expectations, only with the certainty that true love doesn't need to rush to bloom. And in that moment, in the soft twilight of that day, Savannah knew that what they had wasn't a perfect love, but it was real. And for her, that was enough. Savannah looked at Thomas, her heart finally free from the chains that fear had imposed on it for so many years. She no longer had all the definitive answers, but something inside her knew that, with him by her side, she was ready to face the unknown. What had started with a simple touch had now become a shared life, a silent promise that together they could face whatever the future brought. And as the sun set on the horizon, she understood, true love doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be real. Now the question is, are you ready to let yourself live without fear, without limits, and embrace what lies ahead? If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments. Where are you listening from? Your support is what allows us to continue bringing stories like this.